Starfleet calls itself an exploratory organization. The fleet exists to seek out new life, to chart the unknown, to represent the best of what the Federation can become in the darkness between stars. When pressed, Starfleet admits to building warships, but only in response to existential threats. The Defiant class emerged because of the Borg. The Prometheus class appeared during the Dominion War. Each time, the official line remains the same. These are exceptions, temporary measures, tools built under duress, not by design. That story is incomplete, because buried in the fleet roster, authorized in the years after the Dominion War and refined through the 2,382, sits a category of starship that cannot be explained as reactive. These vessels were not designed to counter a specific enemy. They were not built in the panic of invasion or the shadow of cube-shaped nightmares. They were designed cold, methodically, with full institutional backing and no public crisis to justify them. They represent something Starfleet does not advertise and rarely acknowledges: a strategic shift from optimism to preparation, from exploration with the capacity for defense to defense with the appearance of exploration. The question is not whether Starfleet built warships after the Dominion War. The question is why Starfleet chose to keep building them when the war was over. The mechanism is this: Starfleet's doctrine evolved to treat future conflict not as an anomaly, but as a certainty. The ships it authorized in peacetime reflect that certainty. They are not emergency responses. They are standing answers to threats that have not yet materialized. And the existence of those ships reveals what Starfleet now expects from the galaxy: not diplomacy backed by strength. Strength disguised as diplomacy. The shift happened quietly. Starfleet's design philosophy was forged in an era when exploration and defense could coexist without contradiction. The Constitution class embodied that balance: heavy enough to survive hostile encounters, light enough to conduct long-range surveys, and built with the assumption that most of what the ship would encounter could be met with curiosity rather than firepower. The Galaxy class extended that logic. It carried families. Science labs occupied more internal volume than torpedo bays. The saucer could separate, not to fight, but to evacuate. Even the Sovereign class, introduced during the Borg crisis, retained diplomatic spaces and astrometrics labs. These were ships designed to do more than fight. But exploratory doctrine rests on an assumption: that most of what you find in deep space will not kill you on sight, that most species can be negotiated with, studied, or avoided. That conflict, when it happens, is a failure of communication or an edge case, not the default outcome. The Borg stripped that assumption bare. Wolf 359 demonstrated that Starfleet's explorer cruisers could be obliterated by a single hostile vessel built for one purpose. The Dominion War then proved that the quadrant could sustain years of grinding attrition against an enemy that had no interest in diplomacy and no respect for Starfleet's ideals. By the end of the war, more than 400 Starfleet vessels had been destroyed. Entire classes had been wiped from the active roster. And the ships that survived were not the ones designed for exploration. They were the ones designed to endure. The war ended in late 2375. The Treaty of Bajor formalized the armistice. The Dominion withdrew to the Gamma Quadrant. Starfleet began rebuilding. And in that rebuilding, a decision was made. Starfleet did not return to the Constitution class model. The Inquiry class entered production in the early 2000s, 380 seconds. It was not a prototype. It was not a limited run. The class saw mass production, with dozens of hulls launched within a span of years. On screen, we see more than 20 Inquiry-class ships in formation during the battle at Copoleus in 2399. That kind of deployment does not happen by accident. It requires sustained construction, resource allocation, and institutional commitment over nearly 2 decades. These ships were not built in response to an immediate crisis. They were built because Starfleet decided, in the years after the Dominion War, that it needed a standing fleet of heavy cruisers ready for sustained combat. The Inquiry class shares no design lineage with Starfleet's Explorer tradition. It is not a science platform, it is not modular, it does not carry families or diplomatic suites. It carries forward-mounted dual-phaser arrays, aft torpedo launchers, and a compact profile optimized for fleet engagements. Every design choice points to one function: line combat, not border patrol, not deterrence, combat. And it was authorized in peacetime. That is the signal, not the ship itself, but the timing. Because Starfleet does not build weapons platforms in peacetime unless it expects to use them. The Federation does not mass-produce cruisers for show. Resource allocation in the Federation is a political act. Every hull laid down requires authorization from Starfleet Command, oversight from the Federation Council, and material drawn from member worlds. To build one Inquiry-class ship is a statement. To build dozens is a doctrine. The doctrine is preparation for inevitable conflict. Here is what that preparation reveals. Starfleet no longer believes the galaxy will remain stable. It no longer believes that exploration can continue without the constant threat of large-scale war. And it no longer believes that its traditional multi-role cruisers are survivable in the conflicts it now expects. The Inquiry class exists because Starfleet Command made a strategic assessment that the next war would not be an anomaly, that the next enemy would not be an isolated threat, and that the Federation's survival would depend on having warships in place before the shooting started. The cost is philosophical. Starfleet's identity is tied to its mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations. That mission requires ships capable of long-duration independent operations, diplomatic first contact, and scientific inquiry. It requires officers trained to negotiate, study, and question. It requires a fleet built for curiosity, but a ship built for war is not curious. It does not carry sociologists or xenobiologists. It does not stop to study nebulae. It does not divert course to investigate anomalies unless those anomalies pose a tactical threat. A warship optimizes for one thing: killing other ships before they kill you. And when the majority of your new construction consists of warships, the fleet stops being exploratory. It becomes a defensive perimeter with exploratory elements attached. That shift is already visible on screen. In Picard, the fleet that responds to the crisis at Capelius is not a collection of science vessels pressed into emergency service. It is a battle group. Inquiry-class cruisers supported by Parliament-class frigates and Sutherland-class light cruisers. Every ship in that formation was designed for combat. No Nebula-class vessels, no Oberth-class scouts, no Galaxy-class cruisers. The fleet Starfleet, sent to stop a potential extinction event, was a fleet built to fight. And that fleet had been sitting ready. Because ships do not materialize in formation by accident, they are stationed, drilled, integrated into tactical networks. The Inquiry-class ships at Coppelius were not pulled from exploratory assignments. They were already organized as a rapid response force, which means Starfleet had been maintaining a standing armada in peacetime, with no public explanation and no immediate enemy to justify it. The pattern is not new. Starfleet has always maintained the capacity for violence, but that capacity was historically decentralized. Individual captains were given broad discretion. Ships were scattered across the quadrant on independent assignments. The fleet could be recalled in a crisis, but it was not kept concentrated. That decentralization reflected Starfleet's exploratory mission. You cannot explore if your ships are locked in formation around core worlds. You cannot make first contact if your cruisers are sitting in dry dock waiting for war, but centralized fleets reflect centralized threats. And the decision to maintain a standing battle group ready for deployment reflects a worldview where threats are constant and decentralization is a vulnerability. The Dominion War taught Starfleet that decentralized fleets die slowly. Operation Return demonstrated that concentrated force could retake a critical position, but it also revealed the cost. Starfleet had to strip ships from border patrols, science missions, and diplomatic postings just to field enough hulls for a single offensive, and even then, the fleet took catastrophic losses. The lesson Starfleet learned was not that exploration matters, it was that fleet cohesion matters. That having ships in the right place, at the right time, with the right weapons, is the difference between survival and annihilation. So Starfleet began building ships that could be kept in the right place. Ships that did not need to be recalled from deep space because they were never sent to deep space in the first place. Ships designed to sit in formation, drilled and ready, waiting for the next war. And the next war did come. In 2385, a catastrophic failure at the Utopia Planitia fleet yards resulted in the destruction of the Martian orbital infrastructure and the loss of the Romulan rescue fleet. The disaster was later attributed to a coordinated attack by rogue synthetics, though the full details remain classified. What is known is that Starfleet's response to the attack was not exploration, it was isolation. The Federation banned synthetic life forms. Starfleet withdrew from the Romulan rescue mission, and the fleet that had been under construction at Utopia Planitia, the fleet meant to evacuate Romulan civilians from the path of the supernova, was lost. But the Inquiry-class production continued. That fact is critical, because if Starfleet's priority had been humanitarian aid, the logical response to the loss of the Utopia Planitia yards would have been to retool remaining shipyards to replace the lost evacuation fleet. But the shipyards did not produce transports. They produced cruisers, the Inquiry class, the Sutherland class, ships with no cargo capacity, no refugee quarters, no medical bays scaled for mass evacuation, ships built to fight, which means Starfleet's institutional priority, even after a humanitarian catastrophe, was not rescue. It was readiness. That priority reflects a deeper calculation. Starfleet Command had concluded, at some point after the Dominion War, that the Federation's survival depended less on goodwill and more on deterrence. That the quadrant respected strength, not ideals. And that the next existential threat would not be deterred by diplomatic overtures or exploratory goodwill. It would only be deterred by the visible capacity to annihilate any hostile fleet that entered Federation space. The Inquiry class is that capacity made visible. Here is how deterrence logic works. You do not build a weapon to use it. You build it so that no one forces you to use it. The weapon's value is not in its firepower. It is in the calculation it creates in the mind of a potential adversary. If your enemy believes that attacking you will result in their own destruction, they do not attack. The weapon never fires, but it has already succeeded. Deterrence is a psychological game, and the game only works if your enemy believes the threat is real. Starfleet played that game with the Inquiry class. By mass-producing a heavy cruiser with no clear exploratory role, Starfleet sent a signal to every major power in the quadrant that the Federation was no longer a soft target, that any future conflict would be met not with hastily retrofitted science ships, but with a standing fleet of purpose-built warships, that the cost of aggression had increased. But deterrence logic has a failure mode, because if deterrence works, you never know if the weapon was necessary, and if deterrence fails, the weapon becomes the only option. Once you have committed resources to building an armada, you cannot unbuild it. The ships exist, the officers are trained, the doctrine is written, and the institutional pressure to justify the investment becomes overwhelming. You do not tell the Federation Council that you wasted 2 decades of resources on ships you will never use. You tell them the ships were necessary, and to prove they were necessary, you use them. That is the trap. The moment Starfleet committed to building the Inquiry class as a standing fleet, it locked itself into a future where those ships would be deployed. Not because the threat was inevitable, because the fleet was. The precedent for this logic exists in Federation history. The Treaty of Algeron, signed in 2311, prohibited the Federation from developing cloaking technology. The treaty was a diplomatic compromise, designed to prevent an arms race between the Federation and the Romulan Star Empire. But the cost of that treaty was not just technological, it was strategic. By agreeing not to develop cloaking devices, the Federation accepted that it would always be visible, that its ships could not hide, that every starbase, every convoy, every patrol route would be exposed to potential surveillance and ambush. The Federation accepted that cost because it believed diplomacy was worth the risk. But the Inquiry class represents the opposite calculation. That visibility is not a vulnerability if you are strong enough that it does not matter. That the enemy can see you coming, and it will not save them. That is a warfighter's logic, not an explorer's. And it is the logic that now defines Starfleet's strategic posture. The second signal is the Sutherland class. Introduced in the same post-Dominion period, the Sutherland class occupies a different tactical niche. It is lighter than the Inquiry class, faster, less heavily armed. On screen, Sutherland-class vessels appear in fleet actions as screening elements, positioned to intercept smaller threats and provide sensor coverage for heavier units. The class is not designed for independent, long-range exploration. It is designed to operate as part of a larger battle group. That design choice is revealing, because a ship optimized for fleet integration is a ship that expects to operate in fleet formations. And fleet formations exist to fight wars, not explore nebulae. The Sutherland class is not a ship you send to study a pulsar. It is a ship you send to guard the flanks of your heavy cruisers while they engage a hostile capital ship. The existence of the Sutherland class proves that Starfleet was not just building individual warships, it was building a force structure, a layered defensive architecture with heavy cruisers as the core, light cruisers as the screen, and logistical support provided by older classes retrofitted for sustainment. That kind of force structure does not emerge organically. It is planned, authorized, drilled. It reflects a strategic vision where the fleet operates as a unified instrument of policy, not as a collection of independent explorers. And that vision is incompatible with Starfleet's stated mission, because exploration requires autonomy. A science vessel operating 3 months from the nearest starbase cannot wait for fleet support. It must be capable of defending itself, conducting diplomacy, and making command decisions without oversight. That autonomy is baked into Starfleet's command structure. Captains are given broad discretion. They are expected to interpret the prime directive, to negotiate treaties, to make first contact. That discretion only works if the ships are designed to operate independently. But a battle group is not autonomous. It operates under centralized command. Tactical decisions are coordinated. Individual ships do not break formation to investigate anomalies. They hold position. They execute the plan. And the plan is written by admirals, not captains. The shift from independent cruisers to integrated battle groups is a shift from exploration to control. And control is what you optimize for when you expect conflict. The Romulan supernova in 2387 accelerated that shift. The destruction of Romulus destabilized the quadrant. The Romulan Star Empire fractured into competing factions. The Romulan Free State claimed legitimacy. Breakaway warlords seized territory. Refugee crises spilled across the neutral zone, and into that chaos, the Federation did not send explorers, it sent borders. Starfleet established patrol routes along the neutral zone. It reinforced starbases near Romulan space, and it deployed the newly commissioned Inquiry-class cruisers to guard key choke points. The deployment was framed as humanitarian, protecting refugee convoys, preventing piracy. But the ships sent were not equipped for humanitarian work. They were equipped for interdiction, for enforcing boundaries, for ensuring that the chaos in Romulan space did not spread into Federation territory. That enforcement required a fleet that could be maintained on station for years, that could rotate crews without returning to core worlds, that could sustain combat readiness in a region where hostilities could erupt without warning. And Starfleet had built exactly that fleet, not in response to the supernova, but in the decade before it. The Inquiry class was already in production when Romulus died. The force structure was already in place. Starfleet did not react to the crisis, it was ready for it. And that readiness reveals the deeper truth. Starfleet had stopped designing for the galaxy it wanted. It had started designing for the galaxy it expected. A galaxy where Romulus could collapse, where the Dominion could invade, where the Borg could return, where any first contact could turn hostile, where exploration was a luxury the Federation could no longer afford. The third signal is the Parliament class. Designated as a frigate, the Parliament class is smaller than the Inquiry class but shares the same design language: angular hull geometry, forward weapon emplacements, minimal science capability. The class appears on screen during the battle at Coppelius, operating in concert with heavier units. Its role is clear: close engagement, anti-fighter screening, rapid response. It is not a border cutter. It is not a survey ship. It is a knife fighter, built to operate in contested space where the enemy is close and the engagement window is measured in seconds. The decision to build a dedicated frigate class is significant because frigates are not multi-role platforms, they are specialized. They do one thing well, and they do it at the expense of everything else. A frigate cannot conduct a geological survey. It cannot host diplomatic conferences. It cannot carry enough crew or supplies for long-duration independent operations. It exists to kill small, fast targets that larger ships cannot track. And the fact that Starfleet authorized mass production of a specialized combat frigate in peacetime after the Dominion War confirms that the fleet's design priorities had shifted permanently. Starfleet was no longer building ships that could explore and fight. It was building ships that could only fight, and it was building them in numbers that suggested those fights were expected to happen regularly. The frigate also reveals something about the threat environment Starfleet was planning for. Because frigates are optimized for asymmetric engagements, they counter swarm tactics, raider squadrons, small craft launched from carriers, the kinds of threats that do not show up in traditional fleet-on-fleet engagements, but that can devastate logistics lines and rear area installations. The fact that Starfleet built a frigate class suggests that its threat assessments included not just peer adversaries like the Klingons or Romulans, but irregular forces, pirates, insurgents, warlords operating in the power vacuums left by collapsing empires. That kind of planning reflects a garrison mindset, not expansion, containment. Starfleet was no longer projecting power outward, it was fortifying what it already held. And fortification is what you do when you believe the walls are closing in. The turning point is not a single event. It is a pattern of institutional behavior that becomes visible only in hindsight. Starfleet did not announce that it was abandoning exploration in favor of defense. It did not hold a press conference explaining the shift. It simply began building different ships, and those ships, over time, redefined what Starfleet was. Because a fleet is not just a collection of hulls, it is a statement of priorities. Every ship built represents a choice. Resources spent on one class cannot be spent on another. Officers trained to operate warships are not trained to conduct xenobiological surveys. Starbases optimized for fleet logistics do not support long-range science missions. The fleet shapes the institution, and the institution shapes the culture. And the culture Starfleet began cultivating after the Dominion War was not the culture of exploration. It was the culture of readiness. That culture is visible in the personnel Starfleet promoted. Admiral Catherine Janeway, a captain known for her tactical ingenuity and willingness to bend Starfleet regulations under pressure, rose to command authority within a decade of returning from the Delta Quadrant. Admiral Jean-Luc Picard, despite his reputation as a diplomat and explorer, was sidelined after the failure of the Romulan rescue mission. The officers Starfleet elevated were not the ones who negotiated peace, they were the ones who won battles. And the officers it sidelined were the ones who questioned the shift. Admiral Picard's opposition to the synthetic ban and his resignation from Starfleet in 2385 was not just a personal protest, it was a rejection of the institution's direction. Picard had spent his career embodying the values Starfleet claimed to represent: diplomacy, curiosity, the belief that the Federation's strength came from its principles, not its phases. But by 2385, Starfleet was no longer interested in those principles. It was interested in survival. And survival in the post-Dominion galaxy meant force. Picard's resignation did not change Starfleet's trajectory. If anything, it confirmed it. Because the institution did not collapse without him. It did not reconsider its priorities. It simply moved on. And the fleet it continued to build was the fleet it had already decided to build. The Inquiry class, the Sutherland class, the Parliament class, ships designed for a future where exploration was a historical footnote and war was the operational baseline. That baseline became explicit in 2399, when a rogue faction within Starfleet Command attempted to orchestrate the destruction of synthetic life across the galaxy. The conspiracy was enabled by the same force structure Starfleet had spent 2 decades building. The fleet that arrived at Coppelius was meant to annihilate the synthetics and their allies. It was not sent to negotiate. It was not sent to investigate. It was sent to kill. And the only reason the mission failed was because Admiral Picard, operating outside Starfleet authority, arrived first and convinced the synthetics not to retaliate. Starfleet's official response to the conspiracy was limited. A handful of officers were arrested. The synthetic ban was lifted, but the fleet remained. The Inquiry class was not decommissioned. The force structure was not dismantled, because the conspiracy was not the problem. The conspiracy was a symptom. The real problem was that Starfleet had built a machine designed to execute annihilation orders, and the machine had worked exactly as intended. The only thing that stopped it was a retired admiral in a decommissioned science vessel. That fact is damning, because it reveals that Starfleet's internal safeguards had failed. The chain of command had failed. The principles the Federation claimed to uphold had failed. And the reason they failed was because the institution had spent 20 years optimizing for something other than principles. It had optimized for force. And force, once built, does not ask moral questions. It executes. The Inquiry class is the physical manifestation of that optimization. It is not an evil ship. It is not a mistake. It is exactly what Starfleet intended to build. A vessel capable of projecting overwhelming combat power in any engagement, with no distractions and no compromises. A ship that could win wars. And the fact that Starfleet built dozens of them in peacetime reveals what the institution had come to believe. That wars were inevitable, that exploration was a luxury, and that survival required the capacity to kill anything that threatened the Federation at any time, without hesitation. That belief is not wrong. The galaxy is hostile. The Borg proved that. The Dominion proved that. The Romulan collapse proved that. Every decade brings a new existential threat, and Starfleet's obligation is to ensure the Federation survives those threats. But there is a difference between preparing for threats and expecting them, between building a defensive capability and building an offensive posture, and the line between those two positions is not always clear. The Inquiry class crosses that line. Here is how you know. A defensive capability is reactive. You build it in response to a specific threat. The Defiant class was built to fight the Borg. The threat was identified. The ship was designed. The mission was clear. But the Inquiry class was not built to fight a specific enemy. It was built to fight everyone. Klingons, Romulans, Tolians, Breen. Any peer adversary or emergent threat that might challenge Federation territory. The ship is not optimized for one scenario. It is optimized for sustained conflict across multiple theaters. That is not defense. That is preparation for war as a permanent condition. And once you accept war as a permanent condition, exploration becomes impossible. Because exploration requires trust. You have to believe that most of what you encounter in deep space will not kill you. You have to believe that first contact is an opportunity, not a threat. You have to believe that the unknown is worth the risk. But if you are flying a warship, the unknown is not an opportunity. It is a target. And the moment you treat the galaxy as a targeting solution, you stop exploring it. Starfleet still uses the word exploration. It still trains officers in first contact protocols. It still sends ships to distant regions of space, but the ships it sends are no longer designed for exploration. They are designed to survive. And a ship designed to survive is not curious. It is cautious. It does not divert to investigate anomalies. It does not extend mission duration to study a new species. It completes its patrol route and returns to base, because survival is the priority and exploration is a risk. The shift from exploration to survival is the real story of the Inquiry class, not its weapons, not its hull geometry. The story is that Starfleet built a fleet for a future it no longer believed in, a future where the Federation could grow, learn, and expand without constant existential threat. And in abandoning that future, Starfleet abandoned the mission that defined it. The cost is not just philosophical, it is strategic. Because a fleet optimized for combat is a fleet that cannot do anything else. It cannot conduct relief operations. It cannot support scientific research. It cannot serve as a visible symbol of Federation ideals. It can only fight. And when fighting is the only tool you have, every problem starts to look like an enemy. That is the trap the Federation now faces. It built a fleet to deter war, but the fleet itself is a provocation. Because every time a neighboring power sees an Inquiry-class cruiser on patrol, they do not see exploration. They see a threat. And threats demand response. Arms races, border fortifications, preemptive strikes. The very things the fleet was built to prevent. Deterrence only works if both sides believe the cost of war outweighs the benefit. But if one side believes war is inevitable, deterrence fails. And the Inquiry class signals to every power in the quadrant that Starfleet believes war is inevitable, that the Federation is preparing, that the next conflict is not a question of if, but when. And when both sides believe that, war becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Battle of Coppelius almost triggered that prophecy. The fleet Starfleet sent was overwhelming. More than 200 ships, Inquiry-class cruisers supported by lighter escorts. A formation designed to annihilate any resistance. The synthetics could not have stopped it. The Romulan fleet that arrived to defend them could not have stopped it. If Admiral Picard had not convinced the synthetics to stand down, the battle would have escalated into a quadrant-wide conflict. Romulan forces engaging Starfleet, neighboring powers forced to choose sides. The fragile post-Dominion peace shattered in a single afternoon. Starfleet Command authorized that fleet. Starfleet officers crewed those ships, and the only thing that prevented the annihilation was a breakdown in the chain of command. A retired admiral acting without authority, gambling that the synthetics could be reasoned with. It worked. But the fact that it had to happen at all reveals the deeper failure. Starfleet had built a fleet so optimized for force projection that it had lost the capacity to imagine any other solution. The conspirators who ordered the attack were extremists, but the fleet they commanded was not. It was standard, built over decades, authorized through normal channels, crewed by officers who believed they were defending the Federation. The problem was not the conspiracy. The problem was that the fleet existed. That Starfleet had the capacity to execute that kind of strike. That 2 centuries of exploration and diplomacy could be overridden by a few admirals and a standing armada. And the armada is still there. After Coppelius, Starfleet did not stand down the fleet. The Inquiry-class cruisers returned to their stations. The patrol routes continued. The force structure remained intact. Because the institutional assessment had not changed. The galaxy was still hostile. The threats were still real. And the fleet was still necessary. But necessary for what? That is the question Starfleet cannot answer. Because if the fleet is necessary to prevent invasions, it has succeeded. No major power has challenged Federation borders since the Dominion War. If the fleet is necessary to deter aggression, it has succeeded. The Klingons remain allies. The Romulans are fractured and unable to project power. The Breen have stayed quiet. By every measurable metric, the fleet has worked. But the cost of that success is invisible. The first contacts that did not happen because the ship was on patrol instead of exploring. The scientific discoveries that were not made because the crew was drilling tactical maneuvers instead of studying nebulae. The diplomatic relationships that were not built because the Federation sent warships instead of ambassadors. Those costs do not appear in threat assessments. They do not show up in after-action reports. But they accumulate, and over time, they reshape what the Federation is. Because the Federation is not just a political entity, it is an idea. The idea that intelligence, cooperation, and curiosity can overcome fear and violence. That the galaxy is vast and strange and worth understanding. That exploration is not just a mission, but a moral imperative. The Federation exists because enough species believed that idea was worth defending, and Starfleet was the instrument through which that idea was expressed. Every ship that launched from Utopia Planitia carried that idea into the darkness. Every crew that made first contact proved the idea could work. But the Inquiry class does not carry that idea. It carries phasers. And when your fleet stops carrying the idea stops mattering. This is not nostalgia. This is not a call to return to a mythical golden age where Starfleet ships never fired their weapons and every first contact ended in friendship. That age never existed. The Enterprise fired on the Romulans in 2266. The Defiant fought the Jem'Hadar in 2374. Starfleet has always been capable of violence. The difference is that violence was once a last resort, a failure state. The thing you did when every other option had been exhausted. But the Inquiry class is not a last resort. It is a first option. The ship you send when you expect violence, when you do not want to negotiate, when you need to win quickly and decisively. And the fact that Starfleet now defaults to that option reveals what the institution has become. Not an exploratory service with a defensive capability, a military force with an exploratory legacy. The legacy still exists. Starfleet still commissions science vessels, the Lunar class, the Intrepid class, ships designed for deep space exploration and long-duration scientific research. But those ships are no longer the centerpiece of the fleet. They are niche platforms. Specialized tools sent to regions where conflict is unlikely. The bulk of Starfleet's construction budget goes to the Inquiry class and its descendants, to the ships that fight. And when most of your budget goes to warships, you are no longer an exploratory organization. You are a navy. The Federation does not call it a navy. The word does not appear in official documentation. Starfleet still identifies as a scientific and exploratory service, but names do not change reality. And the reality is that Starfleet's force structure, resource allocation, and strategic posture are now indistinguishable from a military fleet. The only difference is the uniform. That transformation has consequences, because a military mindset does not explore, it secures. It does not ask questions. It enforces answers, and the answers it enforces are the ones that preserve the status quo. The borders stay where they are, the power balance remains stable, the threats are contained, but nothing grows, nothing changes, and the galaxy, vast and strange and full of potential, becomes a perimeter to be guarded instead of a frontier to be explored. The Inquiry class is the physical embodiment of that perimeter. It is not a ship that seeks, it is a ship that holds. And Starfleet built it because holding was easier than seeking. Because the risks of exploration had become too great, because the threats were real, and the only way to survive them was to stop exploring and start fortifying. But fortification has a price, and the price is the future. Because the Federation's greatest strength was never its technology, it was its vision, the belief that the galaxy could be better, that species could cooperate, that knowledge mattered more than power, that the unknown was not something to fear, but something to embrace. That vision built the Federation. It brought the Vulcans and the Andorians and the Tellarites together. It held the Alliance through wars and crises and betrayals, and it made the Federation something worth defending. But the Inquiry class does not defend that vision. It defends territory, resources, political stability, the things any empire defends. And in defending those things, Starfleet stopped defending the idea. It stopped believing the galaxy could be better. It started believing the galaxy was dangerous, and survival required strength. That belief is not irrational. The galaxy is dangerous. Survival does require strength. But strength without vision is just power. And power without purpose is tyranny. The Federation is not a tyranny. It is still a democracy. The member worlds still vote. The rights of sentient beings are still respected. But the fleet that defends those rights is no longer a reflection of them. It is a contradiction. A force built on the assumption that ideals must be backed by the capacity for annihilation. That peace requires the threat of war. That exploration is a privilege granted only to those strong enough to defend it. And when exploration becomes a privilege instead of a mission, it stops happening. That is the mechanism the Inquiry class reveals. Not intentional malice, not a conspiracy to destroy Starfleet's values, just a slow, rational, bureaucratic decision to prioritize survival over mission, to build ships that could win wars instead of ships that could ask questions, to prepare for the worst instead of hoping for the best. And in making those decisions, year after year, authorization after authorization, Starfleet became something it was never meant to be. A garrison fleet defending an empire that calls itself a federation. The shift is almost complete. The ships are built. The officers are trained. The doctrine is written. And the galaxy looks at the Federation and no longer sees explorers. It sees borders. It sees patrols. It sees the Inquiry-class cruisers holding station along the neutral zone, weapons charged, shields up, ready for the war that never ends because the preparation for it never stops. And that is the future Starfleet has built. Not a future of discovery, not a future of cooperation, a future of readiness. A future where the fleet exists not to explore strange new worlds, but to ensure that nothing strange ever crosses the border. A future where the unknown is not a mystery to be solved, but a threat to be contained. The Inquiry class is not a mistake. It is not an aberration. It is the logical conclusion of a strategic shift that began after Wolf 359 and solidified after the Dominion War. A shift from exploration to survival, from curiosity to caution, from seeking to holding, and the fact that the fleet now embodies that shift reveals what Starfleet expects from the galaxy. Not wonder, not possibility, just war. Because the ship Starfleet secretly built for the next war was not built in secret. It was built in plain sight, authorized through standard channels, constructed in Federation shipyards, and deployed to defend Federation space. The secret was not the ship, the secret was the mission. That Starfleet no longer believed exploration was possible, that the fleet had been restructured around a single assumption, that the next war was not a possibility, it was inevitable. And the only question was whether the Federation would be ready. Starfleet built the Inquiry class to answer that question, and the answer, welded into every hull, plate and weapon hardpoint, is yes. The Federation is ready, the fleet is postured. The officers are trained, the doctrine is clear. When the next war comes, Starfleet will win. But the cost of that certainty is everything Starfleet once stood for. The mission to explore, the belief that the galaxy could be better, the idea that knowledge mattered more than force. All of it traded for readiness, for survival, for the capacity to annihilate any threat before it annihilates you. And that trade, more than any battle, more than any invasion, is the tragedy of the Inquiry class. Not that it exists, but that it had to.